the torus is rolling, that thing is an example of what we would call a U1 principal bundle over the one sphere. The two-dimensional torus, a fancy name for the circle, over a second copy of the circle. And this thing, which it's doing by rolling, would be called the G action of the structure group on the principal bundle, a different version of the donut in the form of a hair tie. If you start to rotate some of these rings in some directions but different amounts, that's exactly what we mean by a gauge transformation on the node. Well, what this was a model of the observerse. If space-time were a circle rather than a four-dimensional manifold, then the observerse would be a gadget that looked like this. It would be the space of all possible rulers that we could put at any point on a circle. And then the idea would be that you have this bundle, which I've called the chimeric bundle, but it breaks up into two pieces. One piece lies along this space of all metrics, space of all rulers, space of all measurement devices, whatever you want to call it, and part of it sticks out. And the whole game is to get the part that sticks out to go along the ruler to be a complementary direction, not perpendicular, but along the ruler.
So what you're seeing at the top is my version of the observerse starting from zero-dimensional points. And so the curvature on mine isn't intrinsic to the shape, but it's intrinsic to the rotation around the center points that's creating the curvature.
Okay, well, how do we get a space-time metric to emerge? The concept of the observerse is to say, work over the space of all possible rules.
So imagine there was just existence, right? The system conserving information would have to observe itself being the object would basically create this continual loop of never-ending change. Well, to define itself or whatever's going on in the system as existence would then create the antithesis, right? What would existence be? It would be the quality of not non-existence. So now that you have these two zero-dimensional points that have created a symmetry, a one-dimensional plane, understanding that the conservation of energy, conservation of information is going to have to then have information on that, which is going to create a splitting, basically a rotating plane. So that's the plane that you saw me rotating these on. But what happens is because the non-observer can't also observe another non-observer, you end up with this concept where you have these as is above, so is below, but it continually splits and creates these building of dimensions that expand. This correlates if you look at H2O. We have a -2 oxygen, we have plus-minus hydrogen. So if you want to have balanced water, you recognize that you need to have a +2 oxygen because without that, then what are those other hydrogens doing, right? Now, this is all connecting basically our perception system to what we know to be true as far as our reality, right? We understand that this also connects to singularity. So now you're looking at this, and this is the same way they represent the time-space light cone, right? The future light cone and the past light cone, and then there's the moment, the now. This is why we have infinites, and this is why we can't divide by 0. At the moment now, because conservation of information, understanding that what we see as matter is just a concept of thought, correlate this to our reality would be to consider all of the ideas and the concepts as collisions. These collisions are elastic, right? Meaning that all of the energy is conserved. And so to try and do a calculation over a period of 0 time would be to either have an infinite possibilities, infinite energy, or division by 0, where you literally just can't do that because that's now you doing something from the non-observer perspective. When you consider everything as a form of information from this, it starts to make a lot of other more complicated topics more intuitive in nature. So it's like, why is the hydrogen bomb so devastating? Well, because that would be like the lowest representation of information of our reality. And you've just pulled that pin out, right? So radiation, that would be more analogous to basically an information leak, right? Like when you don't properly allocate memory. And then so you have a memory leak, you start to lose resources. That loss of resources, that heat, that literally those particles, the alpha and the beta particles that are starting to decay in that form of heat, you're recognizing that now all of these more complicated physical objects can be much easily represented as a form of information or energy. And so that's why people were worried when they made the hydrogen bomb that it would cause basically destroy the atmosphere, because they're basically pulling out the pin. And if you've ever seen basically like a program completely crash because a variable or something wasn't allocated, wasn't there, the program freezes basically. From our perspective, nothing happens. It's either there constantly or it just crashes. From our perspective of reality, it's basically just higher dimensions collapsing onto our third dimensional realm. And then it's, this huge explosion because we're doing something that basically happens instantaneously. There's this instantaneous moment. There's going to be a moment outside of our perception where there is a collapse, and that collapse is going to be devastating because it's basically erasing that information. So whatever was in that vicinity that was reliant upon that, completely gone now.
But anyway, the force particles behave differently as elementary particles under rotations than the matter particles. All right. So these matter particles, you have to basically rotate them 720 degrees to return them to their original state. All right. Whereas most objects, you rotate it 360 degrees and you get back to where you started. But it's described in an unusual way. It's described as a column of complex numbers, or a column matrix, if you like, that's acted on by a rotation matrix that tells you specifically how these particles transform under rotation.
Honestly, that wouldn't make any sense to me, and I don't think I can help all of my audience to get it.
This is the thing. So this is the way physicists are introduced to a description of electrons.
So now imagine that you have these objects that are rotating, right, independently of each other, right? And so there's going to be a moment in which one of these particles here interacts with another one, right? And there's going to be the energy from that. Now imagine that while they're doing that, they're also rotating this way. So from the perspective of any one of these particles, they did rotate 360, but now that they've rotated 360 and they've rotated in another dimension that they are not consciously aware of, they ended up interacting on this side, right? And so everything now is perceived to have been just a 180 flip. But in reality, that's just the way the perception system is working in an effort to build up the higher level of dimensions off of the...
In studio, these beautiful Klein bottles from Acme Klein Bottle and Cliff Stoll out of Oakland, I guess. These objects that I'm holding up, or you can look up Klein bottles on the web, have this very odd property that they are covered, if you will, by the surface of a donut if the surface of the donut wraps around this object twice. And we call this a double cover. Now, the idea that you have some very strange object with no inside and outside, called a Klein bottle, but that it's wrapped twice by some object which has different properties, namely the surface of a donut called a torus. The rotations of our three-dimensional space bizarrely have some object that covers them twice, just as a donut covers a Klein bottle twice.
And is wearing a cap. If I were to pick it up and rotate it in the third dimension and then place it back, that might be enough of a clue that I've visited. No one in the second dimension could have done this because it required a movement in the third dimension, and no one in 2D will ever be able to rotate it back to normal.
So if we take her two-dimensional character and we throw her onto this program that I have with these rotating planes, you'll see how we can get not only an inverse, right, a chiral or a mirror reflection with respect to the antimatter and the antimatter's reflection, but you'll also see how we can induce gravity as well as curvature of space and time with respect to their correct orientation. So at the moment of the intersection, right, you're going to have whatever intersection you have here, you're going to have the chiral or the mirror image on the opposite side. Imagine that the bisecting lines would be the area where basically they are spontaneously propagating into and out of existence. So imagine for whatever reason, right, there's the intersection at some point in time. Now there's going to be some system that propagates you here, takes you out, then repropagates the mirror and objective. And it happens so quickly that you're not consciously aware of it. And so you're never really there exactly at the time when your mirror image is there, but there is the reflection or there is the reaction or the response left over from them propagating through the system. This would be kind of analogous to our subjective versus objective hemispheres, the idea that we have this inverse correlation to the synapses. So now understanding that inertia mass, or basically the acceleration or mass that you feel as you're moving or accelerating into a direction, is the same as gravitational. And so at the moment that it propagates this point here with its feet on this rounded surface, it's actually basically instantaneously moving upward, but then cutting out. And so it's that snap moment. So now you'll see the same way we have our star or our moon, above our heads and the ground below us, the same way you can see how it propagates from the head down and how the curvature is with respect to where the feet are because of the movement of the object with respect to the reference frame. It gives you the perception of space-time curvature, the perception of gravity, how it interacts outside of their perception, outside of their dimension, and it also gives you the idea of chirality, basically the mirror inverse, as well as matter with respect to antimatter. So imagine like this is me. This would be my antimatter. That's my chiral image. That would be its antimatter. Don't really interact with it so much, but there's more of the interaction between the chiral partners, and then I'm sure there'll be more interaction between the antimatter and the existing matter, so as well as it can be done in my future, hopefully. That's what we're going to be doing, is fucking around with some antimatter so we can get some real special stuff going. I'd really like to walk through walls, teleport, do all sorts of crazy stuff soon, hopefully. Soon. So when you look at this object in the center that basically looks like the star or the moon, you actually see where I have a picture of the moon and it has that same line bisecting it. You recognize that particles, the protons, basically moving through a magnetic field like this, the propagating light itself is what our reality is fundamentally made out of. Understand that light's propagating into and out of these walls. I'm only here because this is the frequency at which my mass and consciousness is resonating at with respect to the particles around me. But for any point in time, above me is light, below me is the ground. Curvature is with respect to where my feet are. But that's only part of who and what I am, because there's the chiral image of
Everything you see here is spun left-handed if it's matter and spun right-handed if it's antimatter. My claim is we are decoupled from matter that spins right and antimatter that spins left. But in a low gravitational environment, it's like my left and my right hand don't know each other. So we have you have the asymmetry of a hand, which is you say, oh, digits 2 and 4 look like each other. The middle finger is the axis of symmetry. And unfortunately, the pinky and the thumb look wildly different, but let's fudge it and imagine that there's a symmetry. Suddenly, you realize neurologically you're disconnected, and it's thumb to thumb on a different hand you didn't know anything about.
something about nerd humor that really gets me. The idea of a liquid churning magnet, the dynamo effect as like a, hey guy, the corruption right here. When you look into it a little bit more, you recognize that lightning, basically electric particles going up. You've got positive particles going down called grounding. That is the flowing of charged particles. A current creates a magnetic field, our magnetic field. So if you look back at one of my older videos, you'll see how I explained the collision, and the result of the collision between the moon and the Earth was an enormous amount of plasma. That plasma hitting the ocean basically would create all of the heat, the energy, the electrolysis, and everything that was required for life. Understanding that now you have this whole four tides, the collision connecting to the folklore behind the moon, the 28-day menstrual cycle versus the 28-day full moon cycle, the idea that there's this tidal locking, the fact that the moon every day is moving something like a couple, like 45-ish million meters into and out of, I guess away from the Earth. And you start to realize that all of this makes sense now if you have a setup similar to what Jupiter has with its plasma torus and its flux tube. Understanding that the flux tube basically flowing of charged particles between the planet and the moon, allowing this plasma torus will give you the ability to basically have at any inclination, maybe like let's say the moon is spun right-handed, angled in, then you could have basically antimatter spun left-handed outward, recognizing that the inverse of this on the other side would be the left-handed with respect to the right-handed, and so that would be the opposite side of matter. And you can see that with respect to the opposite high tide, or having four tides in total but only seeing two celestial objects to blame for it. And now you take that plasma torus and you lay it over the Lagrange points, and you see it actually starts to make a lot more sense now than the whole gravitational aspect. Now, because if you consider a high positive charge, like a high polarity, a low polarity point, you understand that the turning of the plasma torus, basically you're going to have a balance between that high and low on the other sides, and it actually makes a lot more sense.